Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She also worked on conservation projects like Kalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as the Director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for Bachelors of Architecture. The subject we are looking into is evolution of human settlements. The third lecture will deal with historical periods and growth of human settlements. The contents of this presentation will include ancient settlements, medieval age settlements. We'll start with ancient settlements. You have an image over here of the caveman, of a hut, hunters, animals, but there is a beginning of agriculture, a semblance of a lifestyle emerging with tools, someone cooking, children. So this was the kind of nomadic life that man initially started off with temporary shelters, and a community developing to help him live a sustainable life. Now you have a proper settled ancient settlement in Jordan. This is southern Levant, where humans lived without any significant warfare from 15,000 to 5,500 years ago, according to very new archaeological excavations and survey discoveries. Here you have the Maya city of Palenque in the modern day Mexico, but the excavated sites that you see here are all from the Mayan city. This is Catalhuyuk, an ancient settlement in modern day Turkey. Again, over here you can see the settlement has emerged by the river, which leads to solid agricultural irrigation. You have huddled settlements for safety reasons, community developing, but there is a level and play of difference in height to ensure there is lighting and ventilation. Now we will discuss the proper chronology of events that happen. In the prehistoric era, you have the caves and tents. Then from tents it moved on to round houses. Then from round houses you came with straight walls with windows. Then you have the Stone Age graves and temples. Early civilizations we will be looking into are Mesopotamia and Egypt, Karnak and Luxor, Greece, Rome, Buddhism, early Christian and Islam. So actually the lot of perception is early humans are often thought of that they lived in caves, they did cave paintings, they hunted, but all that is true, though it was only for a temporary, considered a temporary shelter. And at the simplest level, this was the beginning of something called architecture, where a necessity for a permanent shelter was felt. The first reliable traces of human dwellings are found as early as 30,000 years ago, precisely following the same logical principles that man was looking for somewhere to permanently settle down. So this was often a circular or oval ring of stones with evidence of whatever local material is available there. So it could be different kinds of stones, it could be hay, thatch, and then a tent-like roof structure which was usually done with wood, sticks of wood covered with animal skin, or sticks with wood filled with leaves. So it could be any material that was available, but the beginning was from a circular or oval ring of stones. Here you have Jericho, which is the round tower, world's first earliest surviving fortified building. You can see the circular way it has developed, the circular play of stones and the way it has been laid. Now we will go back to tents to round houses. How did that transition happen around 8000 BC? Once human beings begin to settle down into the business of agriculture, hunting and gathering takes a back seat and it is only done for pastime and not permanent occupation. So permanent settlements was becoming a very important way of life. So story of architecture, you can said, can be beginning at this point of time. The tent-like structure of earlier times now come as round houses. Jericho is considered to be the earliest known town. It evolves around 8000 BC and it covers about 10 acres. Then from tents to round houses, you have the use of bricks. These bricks were not kiln burnt or shaped. They were shaped from mud and baked in the sun. So because of the hand shaped and baked, it was easier to make a circular wall because it was made by hand and the bricks were made circular in way too. Here you have the beginning of straight walls with windows. This was Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic town in Turkey dating about 6500 BC, but it was actually discovered only in the past 50 years or so. Here you can clearly see the linear lines, the use of windows, straight walls, even though they are cluttered and clustered together. One of the best preserved Neolithic towns is Çatalhöyük, covering about 32 acres in current southern Turkey. Here the houses are rectangular with windows but no doors. They adjoin each other like cells in a honeycomb and the entrance is through the roof. The windows are a happy accident in a way because the houses were built in different levels. The higher levels afforded the use of windows that could be made, and the sloping side was made possible. Because of that, the windows were also possible. Next, we will be discussing Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is around 4th millennium BC. The two areas which first developed civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt. They share a natural product which is ideal for relatively small buildings in a warm climate. Bundles of reeds can be bound together to form pillars and beams. So this was the first time pillars and beams came into existence. Their tops can be bent inwards and tied to form an arch or a dome. And the spaces in this frame can be filled with smaller branches and mud to complete a weatherproof shelter. Then you have the Egyptian mastabas and pyramids. This is around 3000 to 2500 BC. From early in the 3rd millennium BC, the pharaohs and their nobles are buried under these mastabas or tombs. These are rectangular, flat-roofed buildings made of simple mud brick, and these mud bricks covered the burial chamber. They also contain the supplies of food and other items which they believe will be required in their next world. This is an example of Saqqara, the step pyramid of King Zoser, which is from 2620 BC. Here you have the Great Pyramid of Khufu. This is the largest of the 3 pyramids at Giza. This was built around 2500 BC again. The Egyptian mastabas and pyramids, if you look at it, it actually was an innovation of the mastaba. The pyramid developed from the mastaba. Imhotep, what he did is he built a mastaba of stone. As an innovation, it was built in stone, and because it was stone, he realized it can take a little weight. So successively, he places 5 more smaller rectangular mastabas. So the final product that you get was the first pyramid, the pyramid of Saqqara, or the stepped pyramid. Now we come on to Karnak and Luxor. This is around 1500 to 1350 BC. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor lie on the banks of Nile at Thebes. They have columns and architraves of colossal proportions, massive and monumental in personality. This is stone architecture in the most biggest and monumental fashion ever seen in history. Greek architecture does the same, but in refined elements, and it even further makes them slimmer and thinner. So they make all these elements, formal decoration, better balance and proportion is introduced by the Greeks, but definitely the Egyptians are the ones who have started the columns and architraves as the pioneers. Here you have an example of Karnak and Luxor. You can see the massive size. It is actually in ruins now. You obviously know it is not full entire in its length in its entirety. You can see the structures and the figures over here. All of them are massive and monumental. Builders in Greek cities on the coast of Turkey evolved cement around 200 BC. Invention or discovery of cement was one of the most crucial elements that happened in 200 BC, because after this, structures entirely changed because a new structural material came into being. So, in place of weaker mortars such as gypsum plaster, which was used in Egypt, or bitumen, which was used initially in Mesopotamia, cement came into being, which made all the buildings stronger, and that we see till date, thousands of years later. The secret of this new material was lime, which binds sand, water and clay. Later on, what the Romans did is they had added ground volcanic lava in place of clay, which made it polozonic, then which was the strongest mortar in history till Portland cement, or the cement we know of today, came into being. The next important stage of history that happened here is Vitruvius, a very important architect in the late 1st century BC. So, in the later part of 1st century BC, this Roman architect came about and discussed all the principles of architecture in about 10 volumes. He discussed everything from orders of architecture, columns, pillars, to stucco work, painting, aqueducts and machinery. This was written well before all of the greatest achievements by Roman builders, and this is considered till date, even now a century later, thousands of years later, most influential text in the entire history of architecture. Since then, the proportions and theories of Greek and Roman architecture has been enshrined by Vitruvius, and they have remained the basis of architectural tradition till date. This is the Vitruvius man. This figure gives us the details and modules for everything that we use today. The width of a door, the width of a staircase, the width of a corridor, everything is determined by this person's discoveries. Stupas and temples, this is again from the 1st century BC, but from a different part of the world. The most significant architectural feature of Southeast Asia was the Buddhist stupa, known in India from 1st century BC, but actually there could be stupas earlier as well. This is descendant of the burial mound. From a tomb this has emerged. The stupa is nothing but a brick and plaster hemisphere with a pointed superstructure. You can see it in the image over here. You have the dome-like structure with a small pointed structure on top. Enshrining the relic of Buddha, it serves as a sacred center around which the ritual occurs in an open-air setting. This was a solid hemisphere. This couldn't be accessed. There would be a small opening in the ground where the relic would be placed, but that's it. The worship would happen in the open, and the space built around the stupa was only for ambulatory purposes, where the worshippers would climb and circambulate around the dome which enshrined Buddha's remains. Within the simple shape of the stupa, complex Hindu temples emerged at a later date, which made it richer in architectural ornamentation, encrusted with severe detailing and sculptures of devils and deities. Sometimes they were brightly painted, but initially they were obviously not. Unlike the solid stupa, these structures rise above the interior spaces and which are used for worship. So, these are what later came to be known as vimanas or gopuras. They are like steeples above churches, whereas the stupa is a massive inert being, that is, it's filled with bricks at the center of a temple complex, versus the gopura being the entrance of a temple complex. This is what the stupa emerged into this, and finally into this, what we see today. Then simultaneously in another part of the world, basilicas which were both secular and sacred came into being during 2nd century BC to 4th century AD. The Roman public hall, also known as the basilica, is a rectangular building with side aisles behind the rows of columns which actually support the main walls. The focus of attention is at the end of the opposite entrance, where a raised platform is sometimes set within an alcove or apse. A building of this kind is known from Pompeii in 2nd century BC, when Constantine establishes Christian churches as public buildings in the 4th century AD. The basilica is the natural form for any such place of gathering, and the apse is readily made from the altar. So, the basilica, which started initially as a secular building, as Christianity came into being, it was easily adapted to suit the needs of Christianity, where the apse became the place for the altar to place the cross. This is the very first St. Paul's that is there in Italy. This was built around 4th century AD. Two of Constantine's churches in Rome, the basilicas of St. Peter's and St. Paul's, also have the new architectural feature, the transept, which was nothing but the crossing the nave near the altar, which provides more space for the pilgrims or the clergy, that is the priests. Whether this happened by accident or design, this addition makes sure the ground plan becomes that of a cross. So, you have the nave, aisles, transept and apse with a flat or vaulted ceiling. These became the basic ingredients of a rectangular Western churches that we see till date. Now we come to the next important phase, the Dome of Rock, which was 691 AD. The Dome of Rock, completed in 691 and the earliest survival example of Muslim architecture, borrows in its spectacular fashion. You have Byzantine mosaic and the dome roof. This is situated in the city of Jerusalem. So it's taken the Christians nearly half a century previously. It still has the crafts and skills that was firstly used to develop imperial churches, and it is appropriate that the Dome of Rock is the world's only historic building with the word dome in it. Because of this, it is obvious that the role the dome is going to play in the Islamic architecture. It's going to have a profound influence in all Islamic architecture that we see till date. The dome, because of Dome of Rock, became a very crucial element. Originally, it was the flamboyance and the dome itself that got people closer to it. Then later on, it was completely gilded or covered with metallic gold. So, both Islam and Christianity arrive at the same point, but from different directions, and during the 16th and 17th century, it was the age of the dome, where domes were explored completely. Islam completely turned into the architecture of domes and vaults, versus Christianity breaks from tradition and goes into steeples and cathedrals, more Romanesque and Gothic in style. This is the Dome of Rock. You can see the gilded dome over here, completely covered currently in golden metal. Before this, it was just a plain dome. You can see the hexagonal building to support the dome as well. Now we move on to medieval settlements. What were the main emerging characteristics of medieval towns? You have the wall, the marketplace and the church. These three were the new emerging points. You have this, either it was the burg or a village, how it is referred to as in the UK. Again, the settlement happened near the water body. You have two enclosed villages with traditional grassed village greens. So, this is with example as UK, written in Essex. You have a triangular green with a pond in the corner, and then you have Milburn in Westmoreland. You can see the layout is entirely different. As this town developed, as the natural sources and the topography was. This is Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. This is a clear example of a linear village form. So, you have the straight road and on either side developments happen. This is a rectangular, could be a green land, it could be a pond, it could be any natural form that decides the shape and growth of a particular town. So, what was an essential characteristic of both village types is the use of back gardens. This was a concept that emerged in medieval settlements. So, there would be a service road and then they would have a main road. So, from the back of the house would go into the service road or a back garden, and this access lane later on was used by cart vehicles, and which is still date available by horse driven carts or bull driven carts and all of that. So, during the Industrial Revolution, what happened is there was an upgrading happened. All these main roads became more important, and the service roads were used as pedestrian friendly roads. This process of organic growth changed from a riverside trading village conveniently located by a river. Then they had temporary market stalls. Then because of time and travel as well as transportation developments, it became a full-fledged market town. So that's how medieval towns grew. The next important element, the wall, which is nothing but a defensive element, also helps the fortification of a particular town. So the importance of staying within this wall was a massive designation that this is my city, this is my village. So that kind of element came into being, and because of that, the density within that particular town increased versus outside you could see houses at greater distances. In the medieval countryside, people lived in a variety of settlement types. You had individual farms, hamlets to much larger villages, and these permanent places were also where temporary shelters also would be taken. For instance, this would be a place where a carnival would happen, and this is a temporary structure to house the people in that carnival, versus these were permanent structures occupied by the residents. So a particular village substantiated both permanent as well as temporary kinds of shelter. This is the plan of Yarwell in Northamptonshire. This is obviously redrawn in the 1700s, but this village through excavation plans has existed for a very, very long time. This is an example of a medieval settlement. This is an example of a planned village with a double row of toffs and crofts, that is nothing but roads on either end, and you had housing coming up on either end. You have the church and the manor house, which was the most important two elements of any village. Dating such places is obviously difficult, but like I mentioned, this is a pre-Norman conquest era, so way, way older than the 1700s. So now we'll come into the proper period where we can describe what actually happened as in the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire came in. The era, this time was called Dark Ages because there was no development in terms of construction or development with respect to art or architecture. Economy was rooted completely in agriculture. The feudal system became the order of the day. Merchants and craftsmen became more strong. They formed guilds to strengthen their social as well as economic position. And because the feudal system got settled, wars between different feudal lords became very frequent. So this is a typical medieval city that developed with a castle, with a manor, with a protective device. So if you look at the planning of an early medieval town, it was dominated by a church or a monastery and a castle for the lords. For protective measures, towns were sited in irregular terrains, occupying hilltops or islands. The towns assumed informal and irregular characteristics. The church plaza also got converted to a marketplace. Roads generally radiated from the church plaza and market plaza to gates with secondary lateral roadways connecting them. Castle was surrounded by wall and moat as a protective elements. Irregular pattern in planning was devised to confuse enemies, as enemies were unfamiliar with the layout of the town. Open spaces, streets, plazas were developed as an integral part of the site. This also ensured that people's way of life was very regulated. They had a kind of social life besides a work life and a home life. They would gather around, talk about the events of the village. That's why even all old people would meet up, youngsters would play. So it was a kind of a social hub that got created. Streets were mainly initially used for pedestrian activities, and later as the wheels and horse carts came into being, that was completely restricted to the main roads. Now we will discuss as an example the cities in the 12th and the 13th centuries, which was still considered a medieval settlement, because this was during the Middle Ages. Within the confines of the walls, the population was definitely small. The space in the town was lesser because of the fortification, but no one came out of the fortification because of the protection it warded. So, because of that, what was the result? Intolerable congestion, lack of hygiene and pestilence. That is, you had a lot of rats, other kind of pests that came into being because of unhygienic conditions. This, for example, is the city of Naarden in Netherlands. This is a fortified French town is Carcassonne. This is the former province of Languedoc. This is separated into fortified part and the lower city, which is the Villa base. You have, this is the fortified portion, and here you have the portion that exists outside, the lower portion. So, this is the original medieval town that was there within these fortifications, like the floral pattern that you see over here. So, before the Protestant Reformation, it was this church, which, like we mentioned, was the most important element after the manor house, is the St. Witius. It was one of the oldest surviving churches in Netherlands. Naarden was granted the city rights. Till then, it was not even considered a city in 1300, and later developed into a fortified garrison town with the textile industry. So, here you can see how the natural shape of the town has enabled the town to grow and protect itself because of the natural water bodies that are existing. So, what happened with Naarden is the northern ramparts you have, which protect the building. Then in 462, the Romans officially gave up to the Theodoric II. Then he built more fortifications, and the northern marches and traces of these northern marches, that is the fortification, are still seen till date. The Romans fortified it initially in 100 BC, but there are changes that are happening till 453 and 462. So, finally, you see that the city contains a market square, it contains a castle and church of Saint Nazaire. Irregular patterns for street is seen to follow the irregular pattern of the city. At the end of this lecture, we have looked into the historical periods and growth of human settlements. We have seen the ancient and medieval type of settlements. At the end of this lecture, we should be able to answer the following questions. Discuss the type of settlements and housing pattern in prehistoric era. Discuss the contributions of any two early civilizations towards architecture and town planning. Discuss briefly the role of cement in the different civilizations and time periods. Discuss the contributions of early Christian and Islamic architecture. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you.